executive of the Thomas Coram Foundation for Children until her retirement in 2005 after 8 years of service. The Coram Foundation is England's oldest children's charity. During her time at Coram, she increased the number of children, young people and families benefiting from the foundation's services from 300 to over 6,000 a year. Today, the foundation, building on her pioneering work, gives direct support to 55,000 children and their carers a year, runs a child law advice service with 1 million users a year, and has an outreach program in schools all over the UK. Dame Gillian has been a leading advocate for contemporary childcare services and an important contributor to government thinking on the education, social care and health services support for disadvantaged children and their families. But with this talk, we dive back into history to hear about London's forgotten children in the 18th century and the foundling hospital that Thomas Coram created. I would now like to introduce Dame Gillian Pugh.
Well, thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's really nice to be back here in Islington. I've actually lived in Hertfordshire for the last 40 years, but I've worked first at the National Children's Bureau at the Angel and then at Coram for the last 45 or 50. So this is familiar territory, as indeed is this building. Very sad to hear that it's no longer going to be part of the voluntary sector. Also greetings from Chorley Wood iu3a, which is only 15 years old this year, so probably not nearly as old as yours, where I've been on the committee since it was set up. I acquired hearing aids a little while ago, but I keep saying I can hear just as well without them, so I forget to put them in. And when I went to put them in this morning, the batteries run out, so... But it is odd, isn't it? We're all quite happy to wear glasses, although I realise I haven't got mine with me today. But hearing aids have a sort of stigma attached to them, but they are magical once you get used to them. Anyway, to the topic of today. Can I ask how many of you have been to the Foundling Museum? Oh my goodness, I can go home straight away then. Did any of you see Jamila Gavin's wonderful play Coram Boy when it was at the National? And then it's just been on at Chichester and I had to write a piece of the programme there. It introduced a few myths about the Coram here, the Coram man. Anyway, good. Now let's see if I can make this work. So, as I was going to check your name up to get it right. Antonio. As Antonio said, this Coram is the oldest children's charity. It was set up 150 years before perhaps its better known contemporary organisations such as Bernardo's and NSBCC. It all started down in Lyme Regis, where Thomas Coram's mother died when he was young and was brought up in his early years by his father, with whom he had a very difficult relationship. His father was a seafarer, and very young in his life, Thomas Coram was put onto a boat to learn the tricks of the trade, so to speak, and actually went to sea, as it says, at 11, and was apprenticed to a shipwright from the age of 16. So life very much at that stage revolving around the sea. He built up a shipbuilding business at a place called Taunton, just south of Boston. I don't know if any of you have been there. I made a point of visiting once when I was over there. And it was very strange to go to this church and find replicas of all the famous pictures, including this one on the walls. He was a staunch Anglican, didn't actually get on terribly. He was a rough, tough, focused young man, and didn't really get on with the people locally in Taunton. He married into a good local family, Eunice, but he fell out with local people and they began to burn his boats and he began to feel very unwelcome. And so at that point, he returned to London. Now, he was a very ordinary man. At a time when society was very much stratified. He knew he was not able to have children. He spent a lot of time walking the streets and became very distressed to see so many children, babies, left to die in the streets. In those days, as you'll be more than aware, illegitimacy was something that you kept very quiet about, and there was a danger, especially if you were poor, of either being hung or being sent to the workhouse and occasionally perhaps being sent off to Australia. Despite the fact that many, many children were born out of wedlock, it was still, and until quite recently, a real slur, and you felt a real outcast. I remember when I started at Coram meeting a lot of the former foundlings, and one gentleman I met who had done very well in life and was on the board of the company he joined, which is a good place to be, was interviewed a lot on radio, but he refused to go on television because he was still so ashamed of the fact that he was illegitimate. So although what Coram went on to found was called the Foundling Hospital, it was actually the children's home for illegitimate children. So, because it was hard to talk about illegitimacy, Coram was still determined to do something about it, but yet he didn't have the links amongst the powers that be in order to raise the funds because of the slur of illegitimacy. But eventually, through various channels, he began to make links with, he realised that the best way into some of these powerful members of the aristocracy was through their wives, what one might call ladies who nudge. And gradually, he began to win over some of those key, particularly starting with the Duchess of Somerset. And once, and this coinciding with a time when there was a very high-profile case of illegitimacy amongst the aristocracy, people began to change their thinking about, well, perhaps it would be a good idea if we set up some way of supporting these children. There was also an there were ongoing wars, as there always were, with France, and the young men coming forward to join the Navy or the Army were not up to scratch, and government began to think, well, perhaps this would, after all, be a good idea. Any of you who have been to Florence, to the headquarters of UNICEF, will know that one of the very earliest family hospitals, it was in the Innocenti in Florence, was very much linked to the church, as were most of similar places across Europe. But in this country, the church wanted to have nothing to do with it at all. So it depended entirely on the donations of those who could afford to pay, and became, as it says here, a joint stock company. Okay, those of you, well, you're all local, aren't you? You will still be able to see, or you can still see, some of the porticos. I wonder if this works. These are still on Guildford Street. I think I've got the right street. And then these porticos on the side. There was a farm, wasn't there, a little while ago here. And last time I walked past, I don't think there was. But this was the building that he raised the money for. Simple, looking austere from the outside. It was important to look, if you like, substantial without looking glitzy. If you were going to be basing your life's work on raising money for this organisation. It was built on the edge of London. At this point, of course, there were no railway stations, that's Lincoln's Inn Field, isn't it? Here. So I can't actually, no, here it was, up here. So it started, once the building was being built, it started in Lands Conduit Street. And then the purchase of Bedford Square and a huge estate around Russell, what is now Russell Square, Bedford Square. And the building was finally opened a couple of years after the charter was signed by George II in 1839. This is, oh wait a minute, we seem to have hopped forward a bit. I think I might go back just a moment to the picture of Coram. This is, when I got the job, my cousin at that time happened to be Director of Tate Britain, and he said in his Christmas card, "Do you realise that you are now the custodian of the most important portrait of the 18th century?" This, as you all know, is a portrait by Hogarth. At this time, you wore your wig for your portrait, you were very grand, you had your country house in the background. This, I think, shows very clearly a man with a raincoat, impatient to get on, ships and distant scrolls and distant lands here, a globe, globe here, and the charter here. So here was a man in a hurry, a man who was a gentleman, not a member of the aristocracy, and Hogarth often referred to it as his favourite portrait. So just to continue for a moment with Hogarth, Gorham was fortunate. He had a great eye for how to promote something from a position, a very lowly position. 20 years ago, when I was still at Gorham, I used to compare it to the sort of fashionable way in which the AIDS, the foundation set up to support young people with AIDS. It became a sort of trendy thing to support. Hogarth and, in a moment, Handel, both of them were without children, and both of them were, in their different ways, artist and musician, at the peak of their careers, but hoping and wishing to make a greater contribution to English painting as opposed to French and Italian, and ditto Handel, English music. So they were very pleased to be able to be supporting this fledgling organisation. Hogarth, apart from, this is his picture with his pug, his wife, I'll come on to how it ran in a moment, but his wife, they took in families, as they were called, for the first few years of their life, and his wife became an inspector. To think of having an inspector of childcare services back in the 1700s is quite extraordinary, isn't it? So Hogarth had an enormous impact. You will probably know this picture, which again is one of the best known of Hogarth's pictures, the March of the Guards to Finchley, painted during the Jacobite Rebellion, gifted to George II, who was not happy with the numbers of drunken-looking. It's not terribly easy to see, is it? Not easy for the drunken-looking soldiers. We've got a good side and a bad side, and the Finchley and the distant hills of Hampstead in the background. So he rejected this picture and so Hogarth put it up for auction. Well, not auction, lottery. And he bought some of the tickets, and goodness gracious me, when the tickets were drawn, they went to him and he gave the picture to Coram. So he also designed the courtroom, which if you've been to the Family Museum you'll be familiar with. The fanciest room in the building. When the original hospital was knocked down and removed to what is now the Family Museum building, this was a replica. I mean, it was moved piece by piece. The mantelpiece is by Riesbach. This picture is by Hogarth, Moses being shrouded in bulrushes, Moses, the first family in history. There are 8 roundels on the walls, it's difficult to see, this one's by Gainsborough, including the family hospital, Charter House, Bath, St. Bart's and so on. So this was an attempt, well, it was an attempt to put the foundling hospital on the same kind of basis as other famous hospitals in the country. But Hogarth was also, there wasn't at that point any National Gallery or Royal Academy. And so he used the opportunity on the 5th of November, I'm not sure exactly why he chose that date, on an annual basis to have a gathering of sculptors and painters and so on, many of whom then donated pictures to the foundling hospital. That included Joshua Reynolds, who then went on to set up the Royal Academy. As I said, he became a governor, well, I don't think I did say, he became a governor, and his wife was very involved in the fostering of children coming into the foundling hospital. So the other giant was Handel, quite recently arrived from Germany, living in Brook Street in a house, as you'll probably know if you've been there, shared with Jimi Hendrix, though not at exactly the same time. He too saw this as an opportunity for his own involvement in public life to be emphasised. The bust here is again by Guillac. The first Messiah, probably his most famous work. In fact, I was singing in Messiah when I went for an interview, and it all just seemed sort of right. Messiah was first performed in Dublin, but the first performance in London was at the Foundling Hospital in order to raise money to finish the chapel. The Foundling Hospital anthem, which included, I won't read you the whole thing, "Blessed are they that consider the poor and needy," it became integrated into Messiah, eventually the Hallelujah chorus, which everybody knows about, and raised over £1 million, or probably more than that in today's money. There was a huge crush at his concerts because it became, as I say, the in thing for the aristocracy to do. It's very difficult to read this, isn't it? But maybe you could read the words underneath. Invitation to the first performance of Handel's Messiah, 1750. Because of the high level of demand for tickets, the gentlemen are desired to come without swords and the ladies without hoops. I'm not sure if nowadays people have party invitations that they do or don't wear this, but I thought I'm going to give some sense of the general sort of excitement of how the hospital worked. I keep calling it hospital, it was actually a children's home, but it was called the hospital. Okay, so how did it work? I think this is a contemporary photo, no, it's not, it's a later photo of the Foundling Hospital, which you'll have already seen. One of the astonishing things about it is the meticulous detail in terms of the records that were kept. I forget how many double-decker buses equivalent it is, but the London Metropolitan Archive holds these massive amounts of records. And what's very exciting, I don't know if any of you have tried doing this yet, about a month or two ago I went to the launch at Coram of the first half of a project that's funded through the lottery, and numbers of volunteers participated, some of you may have done here, in digitalising the entire archive. So you can now go online. Let me tell you, well, I'll come on in detail, but for every single child there would have been an application from the mother, so letters. The mother's application would have been checked out locally, inspector's letters. The child would have been accepted into the hospital, tokens, details of clothing, of what sort of health the child was in, records about where the child was placed for the first few years of life, records about how they got on at school, records about where they were apprenticed, and any problems that may have arisen. So you can imagine that there were perhaps up to 20 completely separate records about each individual child. Well, now you can go and you can say, child number 3056, and all of these records can all be accessed at the same time. I have to admit, I haven't yet had time to do this in any detail. Were any of you involved in this digitalising? Because I know that iu3a volunteers across the country were involved. I have yet to meet any, but there you go. In terms of social history, the archive has already told us a lot, simply by people delving in and picking out individual bits and pieces. But I think now that the whole lot can be accessed, or half at the moment, the rest very soon, It will tell us a huge amount about London and environs in the 18th and 19th centuries. When the Foundling Hospital opened, there's a pitiful, I haven't really got time to read bits from the book, but there's a pitiful account of it was at this time in Lowndes Conduit Street, the first intake of children went to Lowndes Conduit Street while the building was being finished. There's a pitiful account of the wails of the mothers as they gave in their babies and they were accepted, and a pitiful wail of those desperate women who didn't want, but needed to get rid of their babies for fear of what would happen, who didn't get in. And you can just imagine the pain of knowing what would happen if you kept your illegitimate child with you, but equally the pain of having to give it away. So a system was introduced, which is illustrated in this picture, of a ball, a white ball from the bag. Your child was accepted. A black ball, hence blackballing, your child was not accepted, and a red ball go on the waiting list in case some of the ones that are accepted don't make it. So at this point, it was something of it's always something of a lottery, like it is, isn't it? There was a period fairly soon after the Foundling Hospital was set up, of 4 years, when they had so many children they thought they were going to get some government funding, because this at the moment was entirely voluntary funding. But the trouble with government funding was that it came with a requirement that every single child who was brought to the Foundling Hospital had to be admitted. Well, this clearly got totally out of hand when you consider the details with which the children were cared for and looked after and recorded and so on. About 6 branch hospitals were set up in different parts of the country. Ackworth is still there as a school. Books just been published about Chester. But it became completely out of hand. Huge numbers of these young babies died because they were not assessed and they weren't able to give the children the care that they wanted to. And in the end, after 4 years, they gave up the government grant. Quite the interest, as anyone who's been involved in running a voluntary organisation knows, funding is rare and scarce, but it also comes with strings that you have to decide whether you are happy with or not. And in the end, the government's decided they'd rather go it alone rather than be beholden to the whims of government. One of the most discussed and enjoyed parts of the Family Museum are these tokens. Some suggest that the children may well have come, the babies may well have come from really quite aristocratic homes. There was for some the various names that suggested that this was the case. Some were half of a coin. The hope of every mother was that in due course, when life improved for them, they would be able to come and retain or to come collect their child, and that if they had noted the token, then they would be, they would be able to identify that they were indeed the mother. The other thing that's very interesting from the archive, some years ago now, somebody from Hertfordshire University began to analyse all these scraps of material that were left with the child. Every child came dressed one way or another, and the billet books, these detailed records, retained a piece of the material of whatever dress or coat or whatever the child was wearing. So here we have Foundling 10,563 with a heart on the background of, it's not, I think it's silk. So here we have Foundling 2,584. The analysis of these fabrics showed that even back then, even the poorest of women often had fabric that was printed with attractive patterns. So you have a whole range from silks and damasks and so on, But again, here was a small aspect of this extraordinary organisation that lent itself to a rethink about clothing and fabrics available during that period. Children, as they came in, their mothers were promised that their names would never be divulged, and the child was given a new name. Now, to start with, it was famous names, some of them were called Thomas Cora, for example, but after a while, these children began to come back and claim that they were, from the aristocracy or whatever. So those names altered. But so every single child became known as something else, and their real name was buried in the archive. Probably one of the best things that the governors did was to place all of these children as they came in with what were then called wet nurses, we would probably call them foster parents. This gave mostly these children were placed in rural communities, perhaps in farms or small holdings, and mostly, looking at the records, this was a happy time, a relaxed time. They soon had no memory, if indeed they ever did, of why they were there and where they came from, and none of them knew that aged 5 they would be put into a carriage and sent up to the Foundling Hospital in London, and the doors would clang behind them, and that would be it until they were 12, 13, 14. So on the whole, a happy time, and perhaps and many would have believed that, to start with anyway, that this was their family. So, age 5, they were returned. I often think, not only to have been rejected by your mother, but then to be, if you like, rejected by your foster parents, because this was the system, must have been, I don't know, it must have been an extraordinarily difficult start to life. And of course, many children today, in a different environment, still experience that sense of early rejection. So Hogarth designed these uniforms, brown serge, showing humility and knowing your place in society and being very long-wearing. The education for the time was extremely good. Corbyn had the insight to realise that girls needed education just as much as boys, and the girls were going to be the mothers of the future, and why did they not get educated if they were going to support their children? So girls and boys were educated very similarly. The boys would have done more kind of rope making, and there were quite a lot of crafts that the children did because they could then be sold to the locals. The girls would have done a bit more kind of needlework and so on. Religious education centrally, as children were taught to know their place in society. They were well looked after, well educated, well fed, but they knew their place in society. But mostly they learned the catechism, they did some basic maths, they learned basic reading and writing, and so that they were in a position to take up different apprentices and so on when they left. The diet was good, and in those days you couldn't drink the water, so they drank beer, which was quite common, but they did try to grow as many vegetables and so on as they could within the Foundling Hospital, and if you look at the detailed menus for the week, a great deal better than they would have probably had at home, had they stayed with their mothers. Health-wise, the Foundling Hospital benefited from the support of some of the most illustrious surgeons and physicians of the day, physicians of Queen Charlotte, for example. And the advice that was given in those days was very strange and forward-looking. For example, don't swaddle your baby too closely because it will restrict their movements. The importance of breastfeeding. This was quite another planet back then, but it began to set trends for the better care of the youngest children. The other thing that was a very central part of the curriculum was music. Every child joined a choir, many children learnt instruments. And talking to former foundlings, with diminishing number now, but it's amazing how many of them used this love of music and this ability to play an instrument as a passport into adult life and earning a living. Many of the boys, there was a brass band set up not till the 1800s, and many of those young men, mainly, who were part of that, went on to Hall, the music college, and found their way into orchestras, and one of them became Professor of Music in New Zealand. So being part of the chapel services, being part of a choir, it never actually left these children, and it gave, as I say, many of them a sense of being part of a wider world. So here we have the boys' dormitory and dining room, photographed in the early 1900s. I don't know about anybody here, I had the misfortune to go to boarding school, and all the dormitories weren't quite this big, but it was not that dissimilar. The thing about boarding school was, though, that you went home in the holidays, and of course those children had no homes to go to, so they were there all through the year. This is a picture painted in 1733 of the girls' dining room, and here is the Thomas Coram portrait. So they ate their meals with Thomas Coram literally hanging over them. It is an amazing portrait. I remember when I was at Coram, Frank Dobson, who was Secretary of State for Health at the time, was the local MP in Oldham, and he often used to come to events at Coram, and he always referred to this portrait. Often we would have events in the room where the portrait was hanging, and he'd say, there you are, Coram's looking down very happily on what you're doing, and a sort of what would Coram do became part of how we began, how we kept the flame light, if you like. Now I love this picture. One of the ways in which the family hospital raised money was that on a Sunday you could book, reserve a seat in the chapel. This went right on through to Dickens' time. Dickens lived in just up round the corner, and he has some wonderful descriptions. I'll come to that in a minute. But you came to the chapel, and then afterwards you went to see the children having lunch. And as somebody who's got a big family, with lots of them coming to lunch, this always amuses me. And I think probably, these are the visitors, and I think probably the children, this says it's from in 1872, but this was something that happened right from the beginning. I think the children probably didn't mind the people coming and watching them, because it meant they got a big, better lunch than they otherwise had done. Right, I mentioned about music being central. And of course, once Messiah had been performed once, it was performed every year. In fact, Handel performed it from the organ, even when he'd gone blind, and retained his, he was a governor, he became a governor, I'm not sure if I mentioned, and performed the Messiah for the 10 years after he wrote it until he died. When I went to Coram, this idea of a Handel birthday concert in February had rather faded. But within 2 or 3 weeks of my arriving, the phone rang, and somebody from the Tallis Chamber Choir rang, who I didn't know, said, how do you fancy if I get, and then he mentioned the name of a very well-known conductor, just to put on a performance of Messiah again. And so that began again, what has now become a tradition. Quite a big fundraiser for Coram now, it does rather smarter things, but in those days, local concerts to celebrate Handel's birthday in February became very much part of the organisation's fundraising efforts. So, at the age of between 13 and 15, these young people were sent out. They were either apprenticed to craftsmen and shopkeepers, or the boys may have gone to sea, and the girls, on the whole, went into domestic service. And this wasn't the end of the story. because the governors retained support for, I think it was up to the children were about 25. So if, for example, you were placed as a young woman or a young girl in a house where you were very badly treated and you were very unhappy, it was perfectly feasible for you to go back to the governors and say, I really can't cope with this, can you find me somewhere else? There's a number of tales too of some of the lads who, one I remember in particular, was bullied in his apprenticeship. He was bullied into stealing some sweets from the sweet maker he was working with, got himself into trouble, and once he made his case to the governors, they intervened and he was let off any kind of custodial sentence. Again, when you consider that not so long ago, children left care at 15 with all their belongings in a black plastic sack, and that was it. To have this degree of support and aftercare was fairly remarkable. Moving on then to the 19th century, as I said, Charles Dickens lived in Dow Street, just round the corner. You will no doubt, those of you that remember your Dickens, remember Tattycoram in Little Dorrit, who was a foundling, Oliver Twist, who was a foundling, and there's a delightful description in Household Words where Dickens came to visit. He spent quite a long time in the children's classroom, and there's a wonderful description of how one child put Dickens' hat over his head, like small children do, and then sort of presumed that he was therefore invisible because he couldn't see anybody, so therefore nobody could see him. Dickens Claire Tomlin's wonderful biography of Dickens doesn't actually mention his support for and involvement with the Foundling Hospital. He was very preoccupied with his own home for fallen women. But I had the fortune to meet Claire Tomlin on an occasion, and I said to her how much I enjoyed her book, or I enjoyed all her books, but this one in particular, and how sorry I was that there hadn't been space for this bit. And I sent her a copy of my book, and she was very gracious in her response. Anyway, from the Foundling Hospital's point of view, to have the support of somebody with the sort of clout of an author like Dickens was really quite important. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Right. So, as I say, education was good, but children were very much taught to know their place. There's a picture here of an infant schoolroom in the early 1900s and a girls' schoolroom. Interesting, this kind of ranked platform. I wrote a local history of where I live, and the school that I was chair of governors of was founded in 1850 and had an amazing archive of reports and letters and so on from the 1850s. And the description there of the first school room that was built next to a teacher's, as part of a teacher's house, had exactly this, the sort of rakes of, so you cram a few more children in, you have one not up here, and then, well, there's nobody on the benches here, but there would have been other children down there. It was, as you can imagine, very regimented. Children, talking as again to former foundings, I mean, when they did go out into service or wherever they went on to, they never turned a light switch on or off in their life. The boys and girls were kept entirely separate, even if they were brothers and sisters. The only time they saw each other was in chapel. Separate dormitories, separate dining rooms, they didn't go swimming at the same time, they didn't play games together. So, going to a single-sex school today sometimes maybe it becomes a little more difficult to use it to sort of mix in a co-ed sort of way, but these were children who didn't have any life skills. All they'd known was being herded about, shepherded about, sometimes with quite, I won't say brutal. There's no recorded cases of the kind of sexual abuse that we're hearing about such a lot at the moment. But it was a pretty tough regime. So although they were well cared for and well fed, and their health was well looked after, they didn't get the cuddles, the support, the emotional support the early attachments that, well, the early attachments that we all need to become balanced adults who can give and receive love. They may well have been attached to their foster parents, but they were now a part of the past, and the regimentation of the family hospital didn't really allow for that kind of relationship. Regimented children, girls, exercising in the yard. The highlight of the year, certainly as we moved from the 19th to the 20th centuries, was these summer camps. Children for the first time, were allowed out into the country because when they were at the family hospital, they never left. It was quite a big estate, but they never left it. So they were under canvas, they were out in the country, they didn't have to wear school uniform. Well, they did wear school uniform, but it was a great deal more relaxed. So those were, but it looks from this as though the boys did boys things, and the girls did girls things. So here we have sewing jobs, and here we have them lining up for lunch with the older girls taking care of the younger ones. I mentioned earlier the tokens and the records that were kept so that mothers, if they fell into more fortunate times, got married, whatever, were encouraged or felt they were able to come and reclaim their children. And this is a painting in the 19th century of an idealised situation of a mother, the foundling being restored to its mother. Emma Brownlow King, her father was a foundling, but he became secretary of the family hospital. In fact, this almost never happened. The governors were of the view that they knew better how to raise a child than this feckless mother did, and that whatever her current circumstances, they could still provide the child with the future, with a better future. So, as I say, that is a somewhat imaginative picture, that one. I don't think it would have happened too often. So, moving into the 20th century, by the early 1920s, London had begun to catch up with it wasn't the founding hospital. It was no longer in the middle of green fields. There was King's Cross, there was Euston, there was all the traffic around. Over the years, they'd had to sell off what became Russell Square and Bedford Square and so on in order to raise money. But now they were sort of on their uppers and there was nothing left to sell. So this is a picture, as you can see, of children marching out of the founding hospital for the very last time in 1926. The guy I talked about who did well in business but was still ashamed of his illegitimate past, he was part of this leaving the hospital. It went temporarily to Berkhamsted, not Berkhamsted, that's where it finished up, Red Hill, and then a site was found in Berkhamsted, actually very near to where I currently live, and the school was built on a sort of similar kind of pattern with the two wings, the boys and girls being separate, and a swimming pool and a chapel, and Thomas Corey's remains were reburied in the chapel. It then became known as the Thomas Corey School, and it's now Ashlin's Comprehensive School. Somebody mentioned earlier, you mentioned earlier, about Gorham's Fields. When the estate was sold, two bits were retained. One was afforded, I forget the address now, was what is now the Family Museum, and the other was the patch of land that is now called Gorham's Fields. And many people who know very little about Gorham, particularly if they've had the misfortune to have children being treated in Great Ormond Street Hospital just around the corner, will know that this is an area specifically for children, and as an adult you aren't allowed to come in unless you've got children with you, which is delightful. When I was working at Gorham, behind the bits for the younger children and the farm with the sheep and stuff, there was a football pitch. And the football was forever coming over over the fence, very high fence. And there was one occasion when we were trying to amalgamate a Camden nursery school with the community school on the premises, so we couldn't work out how to do it, and the head teacher was being a bit And then one day this football came through the window and landed on her desk, and she began to think, well, maybe this is not a terribly good place to work after all. Right, now where are we? Right, so Gorham today, you said a little bit about, it's changed very considerably, and I won't make a comment about whether it's for the better or the worse, but it's clearly grown and has a much, much bigger impact. When I was there, I was invited to go because it was in a bit of a mess and nobody knew if it was going to survive or not. But I thought, well, if this is they've got all these resources and they've survived since 1739, surely we can spin it out for a little bit longer. So we devised a plan. Day 2 or 3, Lord Rothschild rang me, who was at that time, I think, in charge of the National Lottery or something. It was quite soon after Princess Diana had been killed and died, and they were already doing some work at Great Ormond Street, and he had this plan of having a huge swathe of London from Corham through Coram's Fields and to Great Ormond Street, all part of this huge sort of park. Well, you know, I arrived there and found myself not only having to negotiate these sort of difficult deals with Lord Rothschild, but also to be in charge, A, of a building project, and B, setting up a museum. These were not skills that I had much practice at before. But anyway, Lord Rothschild went away, and well, we did decide to develop the site. If you're standing on the steps of the Foundling Hospital, Corham is on your left, I'll show you a picture at the moment. And so we decided to develop that site, which had been left a little in disarray and was beginning to crumble, into the new headquarters of the organisation. And I think our overall theme was about setting up exemplary projects that could be evaluated and then used to improve practice. I'd spent many years working with the National Children's Bureau, where our whole purpose was to say, what does research say, how can we improve and support practice, and then how can we use it to influence government? Well, without wanting to be too political, I arrived at Corham in 1997, just as Tony Blair arrived with a Labour government that was committed to reducing child poverty. And it was an amazing time to be able to do innovative work